Welcome back. And as we continue our journey through chapter 10 of Proverbs, we actually just kind of, pulled the tab back on the very first one where he's talking about the relationship of parents and children. And we will see that this is a frequent theme that Solomon visits throughout his Proverbs. For example, in chapter 17, verse 21, he says, to have a fool, that is a godless child, a child who has no regard for God, for a son or a daughter, that brings grief, and there's no joy for the parent of a godless fool. So to be godless means you don't factor God into your decision making. You basically follow your own impulses, your own feelings, your own desires, instead of considering what is God's will for my life. And that's kind of like the two paths that are open to us in this life. We can choose to say, okay, what does God want for my life? Or we can say, what do I want for my life? And sometimes what we want, God says, if you delight yourself in the Lord, He'll give you the desires of your heart. But He speaks to your heart, not simply to your fingers, your toes, your mind, your feelings, your emotions, your senses. And so we often get confused because we think we're going to be happy if we can be sensually stimulated or intellectually stimulated or emotionally stimulated in the way that we think is best for us. God says, no, I look at what's best for your heart, that inner part of who you are. So if you delight in me, I will satisfy you, not in a superficial way, but I will satisfy you deep within your soul so that you can put your head on the pillow and rest at night. And you can wake up each morning, know that your life has been purposeful and meaningful and not perfect, because we all mess up from time to time, but we keep following the path that we know leads to the higher calling. In fact, again, in chapter 17, verse 25, Solomon revisits the issue. He says, a foolish son brings grief to his father and bitterness to the mother who bore him. So when you have a foolish child, one who disregards God, as you see their life progress, you're going to find that you're going to experience grief and bitterness, resentment, because they will turn many of those harms back upon you. I've known many parents who have found themselves being really bankrupted by selfish, sociopathic children who see their parents as just simply a bag full of money that they need to plunder whenever they have a need. And those kind of people will bring not only grief to a father, great disappointment, but also they'll bring bitterness to the mom. They basically will steal from her the security which she should have in her old age, and instead they have taken it to satisfy their foolishness. That's why it's important early on in a child's life to learn how to say no. Just simply say, no, this is the line. You cross that, and you're in trouble. You cross that, we're not going to cooperate. And many parents are just afraid to say, well, if we do that, we'll lose that relationship. I would have to ask the question, what kind of relationship do you actually have? It's really not much of a relationship, is it? And that's the whole point, that it would better to have them not intruding and causing chaos in your life at a distance than to simply let them take advantage of you and always trying to accommodate them and comply with their desires when you know those desires are wrong and the things you're accommodating aren't right. You have to be able to stand up and say, no, that's wrong. That behavior, that action, that kind of stuff is not going to be allowed within my home and within our family. We need to begin to create that concept in children pretty early so that when they're 25 or 30, it doesn't hit them like a shock, like, what have you become? But yet today we find many parents feel that the way to be loving is to just give your kids whatever they want. And part of that is we've lost the concept of sin being a characteristic that's native to human nature. That sin, the willful, sinful disobedience that's in every one of us, will take over if it's not controlled. You remember when Cain was bitter against his brother Abel because God had favored his sacrifice over his own? Cain basically said, I've worked hard, I plowed, I gave you the very best that I had to give. And God said, but Abel brought me a sacrifice that I grew. It was a lamb. He didn't give me something he had earned. He gave me something that I had given to him. And there's a big difference between grace and works in that illustration. But it's interesting because God said to Cain at that moment, he says, sin is crouching at your heart like a lion. He's waiting to jump on you and devour you. And Cain didn't pay attention to that. And I think we need to be mindful of that sinfulness is something that is like a crouching lion. When Peter uses the illustration in his second letter to the New Testament that that Satan is like a roaring lion waiting to devour you. Well, we have to understand that he is looking for the opportunity. And so what do prey animals like lions do? They sit and position themselves and wait for the opportunity to spring on their victim and consume them. And so he basically says we have to understand that because we are very vulnerable to sin, in other words, sin feels natural to man who doesn't know Christ in particular. It feels very natural. And so when we see sin, we're attracted to sin. Why? Because we have a sin nature that is really easily identifies with the sin that we see presented with us. And that's why he says you have to understand, if you don't bring that under control, if you don't begin to lock that up, it's going to spring out and do something that you'll regret. And so Solomon seemed to understand this, and it's always a mystery to say, what was Solomon's childhood like? Well, he grew up in a harem we know David had at least 16 different wives, and it may have been that Bathsheba was his favorite, but the bottom line is he had a number of wives and he had a number of children, and Solomon was way down the list in the children. He wasn't supposed to be the heir. Unfortunately, the sword came to David's life and cut off all of his heirs in front of Solomon. But the whole point was that he had had this experience with kids who are good and who are bad and who are foolish. And Solomon grew up in that dynamic, but I don't know if he was just simply indulged by his mom or not. We can only speculate. But we find that Solomon had real concerns about his sons, particularly the one who became his heir, which is his son Rehoboam. In fact, Solomon writes in Ecclesiastes about his trepidation about what the future might hold when he said, Ecclesiastes 2:18, he said, I hated all my toil in which I toil under the sun, seeing that I must leave it to the man who will come after me. So previous Solomon talks about all of his works, and he was really a highly motivated, intelligent, gifted guy who'd accomplished more than anyone who had ever been in Israel before him. He had accumulated and built an empire, if you will. And he says, but I don't know what the man who comes after me will be like. He says, who knows whether he'll be wise or a fool? Yet he will be master of all of which I toiled and used my wisdom under the sun, and this also is vanity. I've seen that in so many ways. I've seen it with businessmen who have left their life's work in the hands of their children, and they bite and devour and consume one another, and oftentimes destroy the empire that they built because of their greed and the drive that controls them. I've seen it in churches and ministries. I've seen pastors turn their church over to someone else who very quickly reveals that they don't have the same heart, the same passion, the same mission or vision, and they really kind of cause that church to very basically deteriorate and shrink down, and basically selling off the assets because they don't want to have to support them anymore. I mean, I've seen some tragic stuff, and it's unfortunate. And that's why one of the things that Solomon's saying is, how do you know that the person who's coming after you will take care of your stuff and use it rightly? Well, one of the things that my wife and I have talked about a lot is that there are so many things that we have accumulated over the years are really tokens of our years in ministry, from especially my mission travels around the world. I have all these little cute things. I have a small collection of some somewhat valuable old books, old Bibles and things of that nature. And they're real treasures to me. But I told my wife, I said, I can see a lot of this stuff ending up in garage sales or dropped off at Goodwill or the Mission thrift store. It's like, because, they aren't things that are going to connect and have value to my kids necessarily. Now, I can't judge them for that because I don't expect them to live carrying around my junk the rest of their life. But you realize that you as a parent need to watch out that you're not putting too much affection and connection to the things of this life, because it's all going to return to dust someday. And so the whole point is that you need to be prudent in training your kids and teaching them the value of what you've done. That's why having a child work with you in your business or share with you in what you're doing is a very healthy thing, because they can begin to experience what you experience and value. The idea of the family business is something that doesn't exist anymore, but it really was a great place for kids to grow up and learn the values of their parents and why their parents did what they did. But at the same time, you can't guarantee that you can hold on to that. In fact, so many of the old things that my wife and I've collected were somebody else's brand new treasures at one point, and we were able to pick them up at a garage sale or a secondhand store or whatever. So, I mean, that's just inevitable. But the thing you want to make sure that you do leave is this impress upon your children's heart that they love what you love, and they will. They'll love what you love the most. If you love God and you love family, then they will carry that same love in their hearts. And if they don't, well, that's where bitter ends come. Well, we'll continue tomorrow. God bless you. Go in His grace.